I'm really happy to also introduce our speaker tonight at an important juncture of our country's inflection about where we're going and what we're doing and what's influencing it. And my good friend and colleague, Paul Djupe, is here from Denison University. He's one of the most internationally renowned scholars in the area of religion and politics, and he's published widely on a variety of issues in religion and politics in the United States. And he's going to present to us tonight something, he changed the title, so I'll turn around and read it. The Surprisingly Inclusive Politics of Christian Nationalism. Because everything's always in flux. We have to attend to what's really going on so that we can better understand the world around us and understand how it's influencing our world. Paul is an excellent scholar who's editor of the Temple series on religion and politics. He's former editor of the journal Religion and Politics, which is a formal APSA journal. He's published dozens and dozens of peer-reviewed articles and many books, including his last, which is The Full Armor of God, The Mobilization of Christian Nationalism in American Politics. He has his bachelor's degree from Gustavus Adolphus and finished his master's in political science and PhD from Washington University in St. Louis. And without further ado, I present you Paul Djupe.
Just want to say thanks so much. This is such an honor to be here. So thank you to the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute, to the Program of Political Science inside this, I'm going to nail this, the School of Anthropology, Political Science, and Sociology. I can't believe that you agreed to have me here, but it's a fantastic opportunity, and thanks for taking this afternoon to listen to this. So yes, I did change the title just to mess with Darren. But this is actually the title I think that really resonates, and I hope you see how much that I was surprised by this, and hopefully you'll be surprised by it too. So, a lot of things to think about, and I've been trying to figure out how much of my research agenda I can pack into one talk, and you'll see it's quite a bit. So hopefully you can hang in there for this talk. But maybe like you, I've been worried quite a bit about what's happening inside the United States. As we have the administration pondering whether they're going to agree with the courts and side with the courts. And we have the first meeting of the task force for the eradication of anti-Christian bias meeting. And there's a tremendous amount of flux that's going on, as Darren said. And I think much of it has as an undercurrent a growing influence of Christian nationalism. One of the problems with the way that academics have dealt with Christian nationalism to this point is they've thought about it in terms of the way politics has usually been. So the same kind of issues that come up, kind of the same coalitions that come up. And the thing that continued to hit me, I had one image in mind to kind of summarize the way I think that the way that current political science and sociology has dealt with Christian nationalism. And it's Anatoly Dyatlov. And I don't know if you've seen the show Chernobyl. This is about the Chernobyl meltdown. And he was the director of the control unit that was in charge when the reactor melted down and then exploded. And the kind of famous line that comes out of it, and I think it's actually just from the show and not from reality, but it's such a great line in the show. He says in his measurement, 3.6 Röntgen, not great, not terrible. This is the radioactivity that he could measure. And the thing is, he was holding a measurement device that only went up to 3.6 Röntgen. So that was the maximum he was able to record, when the truth was that they were experiencing something like 15,000 Röntgen at the time. So way off. And to some extent, I think this is the way that we've been thinking about Christian nationalism too, is inside this kind of defined space of the usual politics that we've looked at, it's maybe not great, not terrible. I think the truth is actually something quite different. I don't think it's going to be responsible for a meltdown or an explosion. At least I hope that's true, but we'll see. So just to kind of wet your whistle here, I'm going to throw a lot of results at you, but I thought, here's some ways to just kind of get our heads thinking about maybe what's not normal, questions that we haven't really thought of before. And so here's some, and I decided to ask this in an October 2024 survey, so just a couple of months ago. And I did it because I was listening to some arguments that some religious and political elites were putting out there. And I think it's surprising that 50% of Christian nationalists say that they've heard someone argue that we should repeal the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. I don't think that that's a typical argument that most people hear these days, that they want to strip women of their right to vote. Here's another one. 70% of the most Christian nationalists say that they've heard someone argue that Christians will lose their religious freedom if Democrats control the federal government. Again, I didn't think this was on the table in the 2024 election or before that. We find roughly the same results if we look back in 2020 or earlier. And there's more, right? Open immigration is an explicit effort to replace white Christians in the United States. 65% of the most Christian nationalists say they've heard someone making these arguments. And just one more here, that global government is providing the conditions for the Antichrist to take over. 70% of ardent Christian nationalists reported hearing that argument. So the information environment of today's Christian nationalists is, I think, wildly different than what most people tend to be hearing. And therefore, that kind of is the new Overton window. That's what we can expect that they might be willing to possibly accept. So my attempt here to cut through some of this noise is to ask a series of questions. The first is this just sort of something made up by academics to describe something maybe they don't like? Is Christian nationalism actually extremist, or is this just a fancy way of talking about conservatives? Do people actually identify with this thing? Is Christian nationalism really just white Christian nationalism? And I just got an email today of somebody sharing a paper where they had done research on white supremacist groups, and they were documenting the degree to which they find Christian nationalist arguments in previous white supremacist groups. And that's all fine and good. The problem is it tends to lead us to think that Christian nationalism is isolated to white supremacist groups and isn't more widespread. And I think this is fairly typical of the way that academics have been doing this. And of course, then, why? So I want to run through some of the first kind of 3 or 4 relatively quickly and spend more time on the last couple. And here's why we care. So first, is Christian nationalism just an academic construct? And you think maybe this is a silly question to ask, but frankly, it didn't exist in our collective consciousness as a term to use until 2 sociologists got together and started publishing with it. And right where it starts to tick up, this is looking at Google Ngrams, so this would be Christian nationalism as it appears in books, right? And so that's not the only place that it would appear, but it's a nice image, I think, to show that once they started publishing with this, we started talking about it and writing about it. Right? So if it was just these 2 sociologists who started to publish, and that's how we start talking about Christian nationalism, maybe it's not a real thing. Maybe it's just academics talking to each other. I think you wouldn't be here if it was otherwise, but aside from the award winners, sorry you have to put up with the lecture too, aside, beyond your award. But there's been avalanches of academic work that have resulted after they started writing about Christian nationalism. And so here's Whitehead and Perry's, their famous book at this point, Taking America Back for God. Darren let me win a sign sprint yesterday as we were riding if I featured his research. And so this is SIU research here by Darren and co-authors. And then the book that Darren mentioned in his introduction, his overly kind introduction. But it's not just academic work. So there's works out there that are explicitly advocating for Christian nationalism, and that's Stephen Wolfe, big, thick volume where he's treating it as sort of a political theory work. Here's Andrew Whitehead again, who's arguing against Christian nationalism and set in a more religious theological context. And then, of course, there's organizations that exist, too, to try to combat Christian nationalism. One is from more mainline Protestants and Catholics, and then the other one is from an evangelical perspective in the American Values Coalition. So it's not just academics, that others are explicitly advocating both for and against out in the public sphere. And then, of course, there are people, there are religious elites and political elites who are adopting this as their own, calling themselves, identifying as Christian nationalists. One calls himself sometimes an apostle, sometimes General Lance Wallnau. This is when he was shaking hands with Donald Trump in Trump Tower after he delivered a prophecy about Trump being elected to public office. And he calls himself a Christian nationalist. And there, of course, there's Marjorie Taylor Greene with her MAGA hat, who says she calls herself a Christian nationalist, and that's not a bad word. It's 2 words. It's not that everybody that we would call a Christian nationalist actually adopts the term, and this is sort of an interesting dynamic that we want to see play out in some of the data. So this is gubernatorial candidate, Republican Doug Mastriano, kind of a canonical case of a Christian nationalist who said that we're going to take back our state and my God is going to make it so, and had a variety of different public policy things that he wanted to achieve that were very much, I think, Christian nationalist. Down at the bottom, interesting that he's brought back, and he works with a movement called the New Apostolic Reformation. They tend to use things like a shofar, and they're using a Jewish prayer shawl, so that's an interesting confluence of religion. And the other side here is him at January 6th, where he busts, I think, 6 buses of constituents down to the Capitol. That helps sets us up, right? Is Christian nationalism actually just extremist? Or is it just a fancy name for conservatism? What's interesting about what Mastriano had to say is that he doesn't adopt Christian nationalism because that's the way they call you a Nazi. Which I think is an interesting sort of admission, because I don't think anybody was talking about Nazism, but he sort of directly associates it with a very extreme kind of ideology, right? So let's ask the question, is it extremist or is it just conservatism? There's a huge range of literature that I'm not going to walk you through, but I wanted to summarize kind of where a lot of the academic research has been situated here. And so there's the kind of worldview, and I'm not walking you through the measurement. If you want to ask about Christian nationalism measurement, I'd be very happy to talk about it later, but I didn't want to bore you that much. But it's been associated with a variety of different restrictive public policies. Right? So opposing same-sex marriage, restricting voter access, favoring religion over science, opposing vaccines, opposing immigration. And I think it's easy to characterize these as a mixture of both just sort of traditional kinds of public policy stances, as well as those that might enhance the power of people who've been in power before, so it maintains the status quo. None of these, I think, they're conservative stances, right? They're not necessarily extreme. They're more or less in the kind of traditional boundaries of American politics and just on the very conservative side. And I think we've been asking sort of the wrong questions. It's still important to know if Christian nationalism is associated with a variety of different public policy views. But what I think we really want to know is, do they want to establish a religious state? And here I'm showing the appeal to heaven flag. Justice Alito flew this over, or he says his wife flew this over their home. It stands outside of Mike Johnson's office. And again, that doesn't necessarily implicate it, except for Dutch Sheets, who has recently kind of made the appeal to heaven flag stand in for Christians need to be in dominion over the United States. So we decided just to ask. We should ask some theonomic questions, and theonomy means rule by religious law. And there's actually one theocratic question that we asked in a recent survey to know, do they want a religious state? And we don't have to guess anymore. And so I'm not going to ask you to read all of those little graphs, but you can see on the left side of each one of them is people who reject Christian nationalism, and then as you move to the right, they're adopting Christian nationalism. And each one is showing essentially they start at 0. There's no support for these propositions until we meet about halfway through the scale, and then it tips up quite radically to varying degrees. So the least subscribed, and this is good news, is the United States should only award full citizenship to Christians. Only a third of the most ardent Christian nationalists adopt that view. And I think a third is a lot, right? But it's not a majority. But there's still substantial support here for restricting full citizenship to just Christians, where everybody else would be minor citizens. One that reaches about majority view, comes close to 50% line, is that the church should have a final say over whether legislation becomes law in the United States. To me, this sounds like Iran's government, where there actually is a church council, a religious council that would decide whether legislation gets to pass or not. And here we have a majority that think that we should have that sort of theocratic rule in the United States. Much greater subscribe, more like 75%, say it's more important to enforce God's will than to protect other people's freedoms. So when there is a clash, they would side with their version of God's will, and that's 75% support. I don't know about you, but to me that seems pretty far outside of the constitutional bounds, and I think that's when it tells us that we're entering the kind of area of extremism, right? And here's another one that I think also signals a degree of extremism. Political scientists came up with a concept called the need for chaos. It has some really interesting items in it, like, when I think about our political and social institutions, I cannot help thinking, just let them all burn. And here, across a Christian nationalism scale, we go from about 20%, which is still incredibly high, I think, and tops out about twice that. Almost 40% think that we should just burn down our institutions. So we should have full control over the United States and perhaps who's able to be a citizen. And on the other side, if we don't have complete dominion over the United States, then we should just burn it all down and start over again. People actually identify as Christian nationalists. I saw this picture, the inside baseball stuff that you may appreciate. And the reason I chose to put this picture in here is that the guy in the middle reminds me a lot of Scott McClurg. And if you look, it really looks like Scott. And I miss Scott. He was a great friend. And anyway, I wanted to point that out. Doesn't that look like Scott? He wasn't a Christian nationalist, but... So do they identify? Well, first, we haven't asked too many questions across academia about how people feel about the term. And I think the most prominent argument that's out there that you see, from Doug Mastriano, for instance, who said this is the way they call us a Nazi, is that Christian nationalism is a term invented by the left to smear conservative Christians, right? And you can see it's pretty low on the left side, and then it climbs to a majority view by the time we hit the most ardent Christian nationalists. And, it's a perfectly acceptable kind of thing to agree to believe. I don't think it's true unless you have a stereotype of academics as the left. The trick is that the same group also believes that Christian nationalism is the only thing that's going to save this nation, right? And so they can disavow it on the one hand that it's a smear for conservative Christians, but at the same time they adopt it as this is the only way that we can save the nation. So those probably can't fit together, right? But we still want to know, do they actually identify? Does the worldview that we capture also then fit as an identity? And here I used a variety of different measures of Christian nationalism just to see if they all produce the same thing, and they do. And there's really no identification with the term Christian nationalism at the low end, and it goes to above majority adoption by the time that we hit the most ardent ones. And so, here's a thing that was invented by academics not that long ago to capture something that was happening in society and politics. And at this point, just 10 years on, we have a majority of people who fit the definition, academic definition of what a Christian nationalism, also who adopt it, which I think is really a major thing for academics to achieve, right? We don't tend to have that much public influence. And this is where it starts to get, I think, really surprising. So this is looking at this exact same relationship, but doing it by race. And I think, and we're just about to get to this, whether we should talk about Christian nationalism as just white Christian nationalism. And this graph, I think, blows that out of the water, right? There's a little bit of difference here between whites, blacks, Latinos, and Asians, but really they're all doing the same thing. If they have the worldview that Christians should exercise dominion over the United States and related terms, their identity goes up, right? And it's true across racial groups. Little bit of difference here. Asians are a little bit lower, don't identify at the same rates, but whites, blacks, Latinos, all on the same page about this. And one of the arguments that's been made regularly, I call this the zombie thesis in sociology and political science, is that Christian nationalists are actually the ones who aren't involved very much in the church. And so they're the ones that are more idolatrous, that think of the United States as something to worship and integrate, and don't think about a broader brotherhood of Christianity. And the result that we find over and over again is that church attendance, worship attendance, reinforces both a Christian nationalist worldview and here identification explicitly as a Christian nationalist, right? So this is not something that just exists as a media phenomenon, but is fundamentally rooted in many of the churches going today. I've never made a Drake meme. I know he's on the outs, and maybe this is the wrong crowd for it, but I couldn't resist. So I don't think we should think about a tension here between the worldview and the identity. The evidence suggests, although it's not conclusive, not everybody adopts the identity, but we should think of them as linked at this point. When people have the general ideas about the worldview, they also identify by that term and will connect with people in society that are using these sorts of terms to push their candidacies. All right, so now to some of the heart of what I want to talk about, and that's, should we relabel this just white Christian nationalism? And there's lots that have written books about this, and like Robbie Jones, for instance, at PRI, who's a good friend of mine. I think that's going to be a problem, though. And this is just taking a picture of so-called theobros, that's what they call themselves, and they are explicit promoters of Christian nationalism, as well as the guy in the middle in the top, Joel Webbin. He's one of those that has called for the repeal of the 19th Amendment, says, I don't want to see women in the public sphere. I don't want to see them in politics at all. Really quite remarkable stuff. So if white supremacy is at the heart of Christian nationalism, as many have made the argument, for instance, Phil Gorski at Yale, then it's really surprising to find out that when we measure the worldview across racial groups, that we find whites, Latinos, blacks, and Asians essentially having the same scores, right? And they all lean to, this is just looking at Christians, they all lean toward a high side of Christian nationalism here. So 0.63 on a 0 to 1 scale, right? Latinos are just a little bit behind and blacks are a little bit ahead. From that perspective, it doesn't look like white supremacy is at the heart. Now, of course, this isn't a perfect measure, right? Because what they mean or how they implement Christian nationalism could be quite different. And we do have evidence to suggest that that's true. When we look at racialized issues like these came out of a pandemic and the riots that occurred in 2020, summer 2020. So reforming procedures used by police departments, whites and blacks take diverging views. And that's not too surprising. Whites tend to be more racially conservative, and obviously African Americans are not. And that's our blue line is African Americans. The green line here is white, and you can see as they become more Christian nationalists, they're taking diverging views. Same thing with voting rights, which tend to be heavily racialized in the United States. Again, African Americans would want to make it easier to vote, and here Christian nationalism has no effect, and whites are much lower. So they're diverging, right? So on racialized issues, whites and blacks and Latinos are in the middle, are taking diverging stances the more Christian nationalist they are. And that suggests that, yeah, maybe white supremacy is at the heart of it. But what about all the other issues in American politics? And I'm not going to walk you through all of them, but in the paper we wrote, we have about another 24 issues that we looked at. And when we look at issues that are not racialized, like banning same-sex marriage in my state, which is on the right side up here, whites, blacks, Latinos take almost identical stands when they're more Christian nationalist. So to this point, the literature from academics in sociology and political science have only looked at racialized issues. But when we expand the scope to look at the rest of American politics, you'll find that there is a coalition, an incredibly tight one, between whites, blacks, and Latinos who are Christian nationalists. It's also linked to more Trump support. There's nothing wrong with that, of course, but this is surprising, I think, for most people to see. It certainly was surprising for me to see. So this is a feeling thermometer. A higher score means more warmth. 0 is a colder score, and you can see across the Christian nationalism scale, whites, Asians, Latinos are feeling more positive. Even African Americans are feeling more positive toward Trump. So when we get to the most ardent Christian nationalists on the far right here, we're getting pretty close to a score of 50, which suggests they don't necessarily love him, but they're open to it. And you'll see if we looked at it, and if I showed it to you, and the last thing you need is one more graph from me. But if we looked at how they felt toward the Democratic candidates, you'll see that it's about the same. So African Americans who identify or give high Christian nationalism scores are open to either Democrats or Republicans. And so this is something that we saw in 2024 election. And here's data from the 2024 election. And this is the percentage increase in support for Trump in the vote across Christian nationalism. So whites gain 59% increase in support for Trump, going from no Christian nationalism to the highest Christian nationalism. For Latinos, it's 43% increase in support. For African Americans, it's a 26-point bump from non-Christian nationalist to Christian nationalist, and Asians is a 53-point bump. And so one of the things we were seeing in the 2024 election is more bleeding support from racial minorities to the Republican Party and to Donald Trump. And I think that religion is at the heart of some of that movement. It's also gendered. And this is no surprise when we saw a majority of Latino men voting for Trump in the 2024 election. And so here we can see there's no gender gap among whites, and big increase in support for Trump across their Christian nationalism. But among Latinos and among blacks, there's a 10 to 20 point gap in how they connect their Christian nationalism to feelings toward Donald Trump. Men are much more open to Donald Trump as they become more Christian nationalist. Smaller gap among Asians. The sample size there is really low, so it's hard to say very much. But this is giving us a sense of why we're seeing the election results that we did in 2024. A lot of it comes down to their Christian nationalism. Why? I think I have 4 explanations. First is that I think we are underestimating Trump's religious significance. This started really early in 2015. And in fact, the prophecies about Trump as a religious figure who is going to come in and save Christians started earlier than that. But really, the public started to know about it in about 2015 when he was identified as anointed by God to be president. That's continued. The language has shifted. And it continues to play out in lots of different ways. These particular questions were asked after the assassination attempt in July, right? It's July 2024. So you can see across Christian nationalism, right? We go from no agreement, essentially, that Trump survived the attack because God's hand was on him that day, to roughly 75% support. And another one, an argument that I found online somewhere, is that it happened at 6:11 p.m., and that's a connection to Ephesians 6:11, that believers should put on the full armor of God to defeat the devil's schemes. And you can see across racial groups, that's a dramatic increase across their Christian nationalism scores, well above a majority. So there's huge portions of the population that are ascribing Trump deep religious significance that The hand of God is moving within him. And if we want to talk about this more later, you can ask me about King Cyrus. And now King Jehu was kind of the new label that was applied to him in 2024. Explanation number 2 is that there's actually some interracial solidarity in the fiery furnace. So the fiery furnace, it's in quotes because it's a reference to the Bible. This is out of the book of Daniel, referring to what was going on in Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, if they didn't, side with him and maintained their beliefs, then they were thrown in the fiery furnace to, suffer and die. And the story, of course, is that the believers were in the fiery furnace and they emerged unscathed because of their belief. Here, it's hard to underestimate the degree to which people are hearing arguments about Christian persecution and adopting them as their own. And what we can see here is that across their Christian nationalism, they're hearing these kinds of arguments. And one of the arguments on the left side here is what you saw before, that Democrats will take away the religious freedom of Christians if they're able to gain control of the federal government. Another is that they're going to ban the Bible. These are the kinds of arguments that are being heard by Christian nationalists. And you can see that it pretty much dramatically increases from those who are not to those that are Christian nationalism. We can measure it a different way. This is asking about discrimination. Conservative Christians tend to think that Christians suffer persecution or discrimination more than racial minorities do. And here you can see that their views about how much Christians suffer increases dramatically. It adds another point here, going from a little to some, and it's essentially the same across racial groups. So there's some solidarity here in the power and hearing about Christian persecution, and that would bring you together. Maybe kind of a little side note, I was always really curious, well, where are the people who believe this, that think that Christians are being persecuted? And I think the natural thing to expect is that if they live among non-believers, right, those people are going to oppress them because they're opposed to religion. And the way that this was asked in the General Social Survey for a long time, they were asked about atheists who are against religion, right? And many of the non-religious that I know just sort of don't care and just want to go about their daily lives. And so I just wanted to test it. Where do people who believe that Christians face a high level of discrimination, where do they live? Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas. And I don't know if you know something about those states. I think you know something about those states, right? And you can see it in the x-axis on the bottom there, is that there's low levels of the non-religious in those states, right? And so belief that there's Christian persecution is highest in states where there's just a majority of Christians, a very strong majority of Christians. And it's least in places like Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont that have some of the highest non-religious populations in the United States. And this strongly suggests, at least to me, that this is an elite-driven phenomenon as opposed to one that's actually experienced personally. Here's why number 3. And this treats Christian nationalism as compensatory control. So I'm going to stray away from my research for a minute and talk about that of my good friend and co-author Brooklyn Walker. And she just published a paper not long ago. It's called Holy Nations, How White Racism Boosts Black Support for Christian Nationalism. So think about that for a second. This is saying that if you hear a racist argument, that actually encourages you to adopt Christian nationalism. When the dominant frame I think we hear is that, well, if these folks continue to be racist, it's going to drive everybody else away, right? And she's suggesting it's the complete opposite. Actually, when they're racist, that actually brings more people to Christian nationalism. Well, so how would that work? Well, the argument is that you need a basis for identity, especially your national level belonging. Right? And so you have multiple ways that you could fit in based on what sport you like, based on what your religion is, based on your skin color, lots of different things, lots of different arguments have been advanced. Here, and you'll see, this is the treatment. It's called an ethno-nationalism. So thinking of the United States is actually rooted in a particular racial and ethnic identity. And of course, that's white. And so people who participated in this study were asked to read this statement: American national character is based on shared ethnic and cultural identities, not the melting pot, right? For America to hold together as a single country, Americans need to share some common traits. And I highlighted these. These weren't highlighted in the treatment. But anyway, early in American history, European settlers created American government and culture, and this is why people who weren't born in the U.S. and some racial and ethnic groups don't have as strong of ties to American identity. To me, this reads as racist. The only way to be a true American is to be of European white descent. And so the question is, once you're asked to read this, and the study only included African Americans, how do they respond? Non-Christians decreased their level of Christian nationalism. They saw it as racist and found no ability for them to connect with that group, so their Christian nationalism decreased. And for Christians, it increased, right? And so they read a racist appeal that would exclude them from being considered a full American, and they shifted the basis for their belonging in the United States to Christian nationalism, which was not contested by the ethno-nationalist treatment. This blows my mind, frankly. We kept going with this. This is work that I did with Brooklyn Walker. This is thinking more about Christian nationalism as compensation. And it was inspired by the book. It's a great book. You should get this book. Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes-Dumez. She teaches at Calvin University. And what she documents, she's a historian. She documents this long-running theme among conservative Christians that would, I think, celebrate masculinity, even when it's not necessarily Christian. So John Wayne wasn't a Christian, but as she documents, he was sort of held up as an archetype of a good male Christian for his masculinity. And you can see it today in all sorts of ways. I was just paying attention to an account on Blue Sky, which is kind of like Twitter, and they were highlighting some bodybuilding ministries. And so the pastor is actually up on stage, like lifting weights, and describing a particular way to be masculine as a Christian ideal. And so the question is, from our perspective, could Christian nationalism signal masculinity to others? Could you adopt it to signal masculinity when you don't necessarily feel it yourself, when you feel like you don't live up to that standard? And the answer is yeah. So we asked people, on a scale of 0 to 100, 0 is not feminine at all, and 100 is you feel very feminine, where would you place yourself? And men and women answered it, and they're all over the spectrum. There aren't too many men that are at 100, same as there aren't many women that are at 0, but there's distribution. You can find people all over the map. Makes no difference here for how women feel about Christian nationalism, but what about men? And you can see that blue line that's increasing here suggests that the more men feel feminine, the more likely they are to adopt Christian nationalism. And it doesn't stop there. Men who are Christian nationalists and feel more feminine, that works together to increase their support for sexism. In the same way, like going the opposite direction, men who are not Christian nationalists and feel more feminine actually become less sexist, right? And this does nothing for women. But among men, there's a compensation here that they're overcompensating for their lack of full masculinity, right, by adopting more sexist views. And the same thing applies for their support for turning to violence or force. So the question is something like, the way the United States is going, we might have to turn to force to save it. Right, you can see there's a really kind of sharp increase here for men who are Christian nationalists, that top blue line, who also feel more feminine, are much more likely to turn to force as a way to achieve their ends. We're about done. So, some concluding thoughts. This had happened. This is I think the first meeting of the task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias. They got together and did the laying of hands. And one of the things that's interesting about this group, it's a little bit hard to tell, is that there's multiple Latinos here. So especially as the Trump administration worked with charismatic Christians, that served to bring in a much broader interracial coalition in support. But here they are laying on hands. Anyway, so I have a few observations about religion and a few about democracy, and then I'll be happy to take questions or get your darts and arrows. So political scientists have been a little bit flip as of late to say that things like Christian nationalism are really about politics and it doesn't have very much to do with religion. And I would be the first to say that absolutely religion is influenced by politics, but I also think it's not politics. And here's a good example of religion cutting across both partisanship and special racial boundaries that are some of the most durable boundaries in American politics. Christian nationalism is exerting its own force on American politics. I'm no theologian, so I'm going to run into trouble if I try to push this too far, but it strikes me that thinking about Christian nationalism as just idolatrous and dismissing it is a mistake, because we should think of it less than as an aspiration and more in what they're responding to. And so that's the central lesson, I think, of the book of Daniel, is that when people face persecution and threat, they're more likely to turn to more extreme kinds of solutions. And I think that's the key lesson here, is that Christian nationalists overwhelmingly believe that they're threatened. Their fundamental rights and liberties are threatened, and that's why they turn to more extreme kinds of solutions. I think it's a mistake to think of religion as just an identity. Clearly here it's group-based. It's based on some face-to-face meetings and congregations, and we should think seriously about the kind of communication that they're receiving. And so they're going to get that in a local congregation from clergy, but also these days we can't forget that they're receiving religious information from a really wide variety of actors, including Donald Trump, now including Charlie Kirk, figures like former retired General Mike Flynn, and lots of others, right? The social media environment is enormously influential, and we have to take that seriously when we think about religious communication. So maybe I've shown it, hopefully I have, maybe not. I think we've underestimated the potency of Christian nationalism, right? I think that its reach extends well beyond just what whites think, what a small group of white extremists think, to a much broader coalition that reaches across racial groups. And I think it's a mistake to think of it as just shrinking and declining in influence. In my data, at least, I'm showing almost no change in average Christian nationalism levels across years. This is not growing. I think it's actually intensifying. My next kind of research project here is closely linked to this. It's about apocalypticism. And one of the things that we find, so there's so many things I wanted to talk about, and this is my way of getting it in, and maybe you want to ask me a question about it, maybe not, is that Christian nationalism is really tightly linked to an apocalyptic kind of viewpoint. So thinking that evil is rampant, that the other side is controlled by evil forces, that your side controls good, the forces of good, and that we're, getting to a final battle where good and evil confront each other. And so it's no surprise to say, at that point, when we see it as apocalyptic, that promotes extremism, violence, group prejudice, because it's a battle. It's an actual hot war in many people's viewpoints. I think from this perspective, you can see that kind of argument of democratic destiny is going to mean that Republican extremism and Christian nationalist extremism is just going to go away. I think that's somewhat of a fiction now. I don't think we can just rely on just basic demographic change to sort of fix the problems of American politics. Clearly, Christian nationalism is robust, and it's looping in a much more diverse population than ever before. And of course, I think it's pretty clear that none of this is consistent with a pluralist democracy that just rewards parties for doing a good job, right? And we can debate that, but I think we have a lot of work to do before we are out of the woods with Christian nationalism. Thanks. Yes, John.
What is the link between Christian nationalism and what we know about their education?
trying to think about the link to education, and I don't think it's a strong one. I think it's negative, but it's weak. So I don't think it's an easy out just to say, the more educated the population is, we're going to get out of the woods with Christian nationalism. But I can't remember what that link is. Maybe somebody else has looked at that and can help us out. And then number 2 was? Denomination. Oh, denomination. Yeah, so this is one of the fascinating things about this is Christian nationalism is not just a synonym for evangelicals. Yes, they do tend to score a little bit higher, right? But we can find Christian nationalism in the Catholic Church. We can find it among mainline Protestants, of all things. We can find it everywhere across the spectrum. In non-denominational churches, you'll find it, and you'll clearly find it in evangelical denominations too. I've started to parse out non-denominational Christians from denominational Christians. I think it's a little bit higher among non-denominational Christians, which I think isn't too surprising. So I've been moving away from thinking about denominations as kind of the holders of these worldviews, because especially given the communication environment and social media, it's cutting across those religious environments quite a bit. Right. And of course, people have said that, that presidents have that kind of special perspective. And there's some out there who believe that all political leaders have this. And what's interesting is that it's, I don't know if hijacked is the word, but it's certainly become partisan. And some are more likely to grant that kind of status to a Republican, and especially to Trump, than to any other kind of political figure. So it's clearly started to move across political lines and focus on. I call Christian nationalism in that book that we published as a partisan project. And I don't think it's necessarily from the political party, but the implications of it are clearly to elevate a Republican politician over others. But there is a tradition of just saying like all political leaders, because all events are guided by God's hand, right? And so that would be the extension. It's a good question. Yes? That's a great question. And to some extent, I mean, because you can see it in the Bible, right? I mean, it's been there from the beginning. In fact, that was sort of the purpose of some passages, was to give people comfort as they were facing persecution as minorities in, across the Middle East. That's continued for a long time, even in states that were controlled by Christians. But now I think it's taken on additional significance after 2015. So 2015 was so pivotal because that was when Obergefell was handed down by the Supreme Court that granted same-sex marriage, right? And it was at this point that many conservative Christian groups started really talking about religious freedom, because they were saying, we're about to get persecuted. We're not going to be able to hire who we want. We're not going to be able to express our views, that we're going to be a permanent minority starting in 2015. And of course, who comes on the scene in 2015 to elevate that kind of discourse? Donald Trump, right? And he comes in and says, I'm going to be your champion because you're being persecuted. So to some extent, it's been there from the beginning. You can find biblical justification for taking those views and what to do about it, right? But the politics of the moment of the last 10 years have really elevated those notions. Yes?
I've often been surprised that Christian practitioners of Christianity regard Donald Trump as an exemplar, but do you think that's because of the masculinity factor?
That's a great question. I find it hard to see the masculinity in it, but he certainly uses that language, right? And that was, the surprising thing after the Hollywood tape came out, right? There were so many defenders that just sort of gave him a mulligan for locker room talk. So there probably is a masculinity kind of dimension there that leaders should get a free pass for this kind of thing, because that's what they do. I think that part is something they put up with, and it's more about his special role in being able to champion Christians at a time when they were feeling persecuted. But certainly, like, being very kind of overt about it, being sort of militant about it, certainly fed the kind of preferred masculinity that comes from that group. Yes?
So I was wondering if you could discuss the relationship nationalism, material, non-material. Any,
Yeah, so I understand what you're saying. Is there support here for...
Yeah, so essentially I was asking whether there is a relationship between material factors and Christian nationalism, such as income, maybe some others. Well, education is probably not, as you mentioned, or maybe not strongly, but what about others? Because the states you showed on the slides
tend to be poor.
Mississippi, and yeah, they are on the poorer side of the spectrum in the U.S. So I was wondering whether it is a factor. Yeah, thanks.
Right. Yes, from what I recall of looking at these relationships, that's right. And there has been a historic kind of relationship between lower education and conservative Christianity. Some of that from evangelical denominations has erased, so it's become less of a gap over time. Christian nationalists, I think, tend to be a little bit less educated and a little bit less income. And the question then is what does their support for public policy look like? Are they willing to expand a state to take care of its people or not? And you could think if you're going to have an integralist kind of integration of the church and the state, that maybe they do want to work together to provide social welfare for people. But there's been a long libertarian kind of link between conservative Christianity and its politics and business, kind of big business, since World War II. And in fact, according to Matthew Sutton, it was like big oil interests that were really interested in getting conservative Christians on their side to support more kind of libertarian economics. And so that link has been around for a long time. And of course, it intensified with Ronald Reagan running for president in 1980 and has been sort of unbroken ever since. So I think it's been more on the symbolic side, and certainly has been more toward freedom, because big government, if it steps in and provides social welfare, is also then going to restrict people's rights and liberties, I think the argument goes.
So I am wondering how do you measure the variable of Christian nationalism that you have? Because
You took the bait. All right.
Because I was listening to a story on NPR, I think, coming into work yesterday, and it noted something that I'd heard before, but that typically people who respond that they are evangelical aren't necessarily churchgoers, and so they can say that they have this belief set, but they're not actually necessarily going to church. And so that got me thinking about how you measure.
Yeah, that's great. And probably the person interviewed for that story was proud graduate of SIU, Ryan Burge, because he's found that more conservative folks from whatever religion you can imagine, there are evangelical Muslims out there, of all things. So you can find evangelicalism across the religious spectrum. So when we measure Christian nationalism, here is one of the scales that we use. This is the first one. This is the one by Whitehead and Perry that kind of set this whole literature in motion. And if you look at it, it won't take you long for you to come up with some objections, I think. So for instance, if we look at the last two, they don't mention anything about Christianity. It's just prayer in schools and display of religious symbols in public spaces. So what does that have to do with Christian nationalism? So one of the things that we ended up doing, because we thought, this is maybe a little bit iffy, is add some more exclusive language. So if the federal government should advocate Christian values, what does that mean? Is that we should treat, others as, as your neighbor, that sort of thing, right? Is it golden rule stuff, or is it something more exclusive that's only supposed to benefit Christians? And so we added for the benefit of Christians, or federal government should allow Christian prayer in public schools or Christian symbols in public spaces. And the question is, does that induce much of a change in Christian nationalism? And the answer is largely no. Yes, there's a little bit of a drop in support for these positions when you add that exclusivist language. But what this really told us, and some other evidence that I won't go into here, is that it almost doesn't matter. People know what you're talking about when you answer these questions. Yes.
Two questions. One, when you look at the effects of Christian nationalism on attitudes and behavior, controlling for ideology and party identification, how does religious nationalism hold up relative to those other factors? And second question is, I hope this is fair, was George Washington a Christian nationalist?
Yeah, I like those questions. So number one is in models, when we control for lots of things and do our social science thing, Christian nationalism does tend to hang in there. It still produces effects. It's not just republicanism dressed up in a Christian robe. So it is doing something distinctive. In fact, there's plenty of Republicans that are not Christian nationalists. There are ones that are, right? And same thing, we can find Christian nationalist Democrats, and we can find Christian nationalist independents. And all of these things are having effects on people's attitudes and behaviors. They are much more, I didn't talk about behavior very much, but they are much more involved in politics than those who are not Christian nationalists. A good bit of that is because they're involved in churches, right? And that helps them get skills and motivation and recruitment to get involved. But some of it is the worldview itself, right? Is propels them into politics. So I would say that it does have effects when we control for a wide variety of things. And then the second one is about George Washington or other political figures that have said, offer a day of thanksgiving, for instance, right, who had invoked God in over their proceedings. And the answer is I don't think so. I would not call him a Christian nationalist. It's not too hard to find examples of elites early on who did call for more religion in the public sphere and for it to be more exclusive to Christians. But most of the founding generation was not that, and that's why they didn't include that sort of thing in the Constitution itself. So I would not call him a Christian nationalist. Yes?
So I have a question about the race relations in regard, because I always thought Christian nationalism was most definitely a predominantly white space. And I keep thinking about what you showed. It was like the study that was done where it was the racist argument.
Right.
And that one. But then for Black people, their agreement with it increased. It doesn't make sense in my head why that would even happen. Is it the only thing I'm thinking of is it they're trying to do that to fit in, maybe? I don't know. What do you think? That's
the argument.
Yeah.
That's a nice synopsis of the argument. So if you want to hang out with you come to college, right, and you don't know how to make friends, and you have some things that you like, and you're a diverse person, right, and you find a group that really likes ice cream and doesn't like the fact that you ride bikes. Well, maybe you just kind of put the bike in the garage, leave that at home, and focus on the ice cream or whatever, right? I mean, so we can constantly shift who we are and how we present ourselves to kind of enhance our belonging to fit in. And that's what we think is going on with Christian nationalism here, is if you challenge race as a way to fit in and belong in the nation, to be considered a true American, right? Well, okay, we'll just shift a little bit and we'll embrace the Christian part, which is not disputed.
So, do you think the main leaders per se of Christian nationalism are mainly white, and it's them kind of pushing this ideology, and then people of other races and ethnicities are joining in?
I think that answer is complicated, in part because we haven't been looking for other elites that have been pushing these kinds of narratives. However, if we look at, say, the North Carolina governor's race this last round, it is absolutely true that there was a black Republican who was very Christian nationalist running. There was also a really interesting photo and commentary by someone I follow on social media who went to an African-American Baptist church and saw on stage that there were some other white Christian nationalists and Latino Christian nationalists, and he thought, but the black church is liberal, it's democratic. What are these people who are clearly Republicans doing up there? And then it was like, oh, maybe, they see everything shifting, and that maybe we have to find a way to fit in here, and this is a way to show our Christian brotherhood, right, as a way to kind of maintain a space in a new shifting landscape.
I'll give this a try. I'm curious about the interaction between gender, the femininity scale, and Christian nationalism, and that it was increasing support for violence and sexism. Have you thought about how to talk to Christian nationalists about gender to change that? I'm trying to think of solutions here and how to educate and think about it.
We've just started doing some work about how to, interventions that we could do to counter Christian nationalism. And so far, one of them has been to emphasize just basic theology that would suggest there's a broader Christian brotherhood that extends beyond the United States, and maybe that helps to tamp down the nationalism part by emphasizing the Christian part. And we did find that works, especially for people who really care about theology and sort of biblical authority, which is a limited range of people. We did another one where we looked at support for pluralism. So if we just, push the values of religious pluralism, just a basic kind of American idea of melting pot and that sort of thing, right? Maybe that can do it, but we found that the threat that people tend to feel overwhelms that sense of pluralism that so many Americans actually adopt. And we're just beginning to start a project that's really focused on complementarianism, and that's that men and women have different, responsibilities in the sphere that fit together but are distinct. And so, men is for public and women are for private and that sort of thing. And so I think part of that project is going to be thinking about this question that you're asking. But so far, I don't think anybody's asking that question. And it's so ingrained in conservative Christian worldview at this point, and it seems to be ascending. One of the more troubling pieces of evidence that I've seen in the last, couple of months actually, has been looking at young men. So one of the most kind of enduring findings in the sociology of religion is that there's a gender gap, and women are more religious and men are less religious. And you find it everywhere across the world, with a few exceptions. Among young men and women, that gap is erased. This is the first time that's happened, right? And so women are de-identifying with religion, and men are identifying at higher rates with religion, and that it's a particular kind of religion. It's much more likely to be Christian nationalist, actually. It's more likely to be evangelical. They tend to attend at high rates and be involved in the church at high rates, and we think it has a gender ideology. They're saying, you may think that you've lost something, that you have a lower status, but we're offering you a higher status, that you should be in control. And under those kind of conditions where you think that equality means a loss, how do you counter that, right? And I think that's a major, major project for society to think about going forward. So I have no answer for you, is what I'm saying, but it's on the agenda. These are things that we should be talking about.
Could you elaborate more on America as a religion in and of itself and loop in the military and patriotism?
Well, I think that association is going to grow under the current defense secretary. But, the larger kind of idea is that the United States has long had a civil religion. That is, there are basic symbols that can be associated with the United States. And you go to the mall in Washington, D.C., and they all look like temples and this sort of thing, right? We have our days of Thanksgiving. And so, the sort of vision of how the United States is set up and functions looks very much like religion, and that holds us together. What's changed, I think, is that it's less unifying now. And in fact, it's actually support for civil religion is actually correlated with Christian nationalism. So it's less of an enduring, binding force these days, and it's becoming more divisive. So it's falling apart, which makes sense when you have 30, and now a majority of Gen Z is non-religious or very close to that. So it makes us wonder what are the commonalities that are going to allow us to stay together as a nation. And I'm not exactly clear what those are going to be when we think about the United States in very different ways with very different values and beliefs. Did that answer it?
I just wanted to say
more.
that it's more of a statement that I think one of the most important things you highlighted is the apocalyptic scenario, the desire that's been propounded by a lot of conservative evangelical Christians for years to kind of force God's hand to bring about Armageddon and bring in the millennial kingdom of Christ. That's the reason why so many conservative evangelicals support the nation of Israel, for example, and other things. So I think, to me, that's one of the most important things you highlighted in the entire talk.
I appreciate that. That's the next book. Be out in about a year or so. I completely agree. Driving in, I saw a sign that was "God will destroy the USA," which is part of that, right? The USA as Babylon. That's facing the end times. That's persecuting Christians. I think that's the worldview that's really guiding much of what we're seeing. So I appreciate that. I think that was it. So thank you so much. You were released to your Thursday.